Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, Florida, North America's first place city. And today we begin the story of the evolution of city government for Pensacola, a story which literally does span portions of 3 different centuries. It began, of course, in the latter part of the 18-teens when Andrew Jackson invaded the territory that then belonged to Spain. The invasion ultimately led to a treaty which made Florida part of the United States, and Andrew Jackson himself was appointed to become the first governor. He arrived in the area along with several companies of infantry, a band, his wife, and the ceremony was to begin, of course, in what we today call Plaza Ferdinand in July of 1821. Now, Jackson met that day with about 700 people. That was basically the entire population of the area, of course, in addition to which, of course, was the Spanish government officials, all of whom, of course, were about to depart, as was their military. The ceremony was conducted, and at that time, Andrew Jackson did something rather unique. He had 2 interpreters, one on his left and one on his right, so that the Spanish and French-speaking peoples in his audience could understand what he said. And the first thing he did was to make them officially citizens of the United States. Secondly, he announced that as of that day, he was appointing a small number of people to be the aldermen of the city of Pensacola, the city council, if you will. And for this, of course, he also had a charter. The charter had been approved by the Congress of the United States, and at that point in time, it included just 8 ordinances by which the new alderman would govern the area. That ceremony took place, and in addition to talking about the city government, of course, Jackson told his audience that the entire territory was to be divided in half, for one part to be Escambia County on the west, and St. Johns County extending down to the Keys, and that the territory would be under the guidance of a legislative assembly, which would meet annually to discuss the overall laws necessary for governance here. And so things began. Some of the people, you might be interested in a few of the names that were in that first council. Now, these were people who were already identified as leading citizens. And the man chosen first was George Bowie. George Bowie was the first mayor of the city. In addition to that, we had William Burnett, Henry Machelet, John Kaiser, George Fisher, John Innerarity, and Dr. John Brosenham. And these were the first men to govern. And of course, the citizens to whom this was addressed, these 700 people, were going through something brand new, because they had never been part of a community in which there was that form of governance. Previously, it had been done by a governor and a small council of his own, appointed by the king or the viceroy, and as a consequence, this was all new to them. And when Jackson told them that this council was going to serve for the next 9 months, and then that in the following April, all of the males would have an opportunity to vote, to choose to either keep this council in office or to choose new people. And of course, this was all very new to the people living in Pensacola at that time, but they got started. Now, among the other things that the council could do was to appoint a marshal. And the marshal, of course, was the peacekeeper. And the city government was going to take place, as was the office of the county commission. All of these people were to have as their headquarters the old building which had originally been called Government House, built by the Spanish way back in the middle of the 18th century. It had been improved by the British, enlarged further by the Spanish in recent times. Now this building down on the waterfront was the headquarters for city government, and so things began. Now, these folks, of course, were quickly joined by these citizens were quickly joined by others who were coming in from outside. These were Americans, all of whom saw Florida as a new area of great opportunity. They foresaw land values rising, new businesses coming into play. All of these things were part of a dream, and people flooded in. And so before we had gone many months, Pensacola had, in addition to its city council and the ongoing businesses that had been here, they had the arrival of some men who were lawyers, people who were going to help bring the new form of American law and jurisprudence into this area. And among those was a very interesting man by the name of Benjamin Drake Wright. And Mr. Wright became the foremost attorney of his time in this area. And actually he would be a leader of that sort for almost half a century. Then very quickly, Mr. Wright also took over and became the owner and editor and publisher of the newspaper, which he called the Advertiser and Gazette. And that paper itself would be the journal of the area for almost the next 50 years. Now, in addition to that, things began to change in terms of the economy. And in this, of course, the city council and the people of Pensacola were very fortunate, because it was at this exact time that President Monroe issued what we all have noted in our school books as the Monroe Doctrine, a warning to the French and the British that they were not welcome in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, to accompany the doctrine, the United States Congress and the Navy Department and the Coast Artillery Departments put forth a new plan. First of all, to build a Navy Yard out on the western tip of the area, and secondly, to protect that Navy Yard by the construction of a string of forts. Lewis Warrington came here as the first commandant for the Navy Yard, Captain William Chase to build the forts. And of course, all of this began to change the total economy of the area. Because to build the forts, both Chase and Warrington had to have supplies of key materials, particularly lumber and brick. And for this, I think we could honestly say they sponsored private businesses starting brick yards and lumber mills, most of which were up the Escambia River. The materials that were produced were brought down by small barges, which were propelled by what we believe were the first small tugboats that were brought here for that particular purpose. Well, now, all of this begins to develop over the first 10 years of the community. And as it does, a whole new vista comes in, because we're becoming Americanized. And by the time we've gone just a few years, many of the new people who have arrived here are saying, well, our number one need right now is to have access to the United States mail. We have to have the mail. And of course, the only way basically it could come at that particular time was by boat or by ship coming clear around the Keys into Pensacola. And that was much, much too slow. And so they began to promote through the territorial legislature and then through the United States Congress to have a mail packet service developed, which would bring the mail here. Now, it took a while, but finally they did indeed get a mail packet service by probably among the very first steam vessels that called at Pensacola. This packet service would originate in Mobile, would come to Pensacola every second day, and this was our mail service, and it worked. Now, at the same time, as we approach the year 1830, the local businesses were saying, now, there are other things that we have got to have here. We are operating in the wilderness because we are so cut off from the rest of the country. And one thing that we absolutely need is a bank. And the second thing we ought to be able to work on at least, is this brand new idea that is just being executed in the Northeast, and that is the construction of a railroad. And so beginning in the early part of the 1830s, a group of men, and by the way, Captain Chase, the engineer, was part of this, and they were led in by another gentleman named Walter Gregory, who had come here from the Alabama area. And these men proposed, first of all, to create a state bank, which of course had to have the agreement of the legislature. And that bank would not only serve the purposes of local of commerce, but that bank would be the conduit for bonds with which the funds would be raised, of course, to build the railroad. And all of this began to come together in the year 1832-33, and the first state bank was put in business down on Palafox Street. And as that happened, of course, everyone was just so excited because Pensacola not only was going to have its bank, which it did, but then everyone had the dream that this railroad line would move north to northeast into Georgia, hopefully to come as a terminus at Columbus, Georgia. Well, all of these things began in the 1830s, and they went step by step. But then, even with all the great planning that people were doing here, they ran into a stone wall, really, because in 1837, the entire entire country was caught up in a financial panic, which was the result, of course, of the closing of the United States Bank in Philadelphia, that bank, of course, being the national conduit for federal currency. When that happened, every place, every kind of business just was affected. The bank here was forced to close, and when the bank closed, the financing arrangement for the railroad ended, and the railroad itself was shut down and never completed. So that's basically the way things as we moved into the 1840s. Now, in all of this, we are now moving through a time in which the entire nation is being caught up in the issues of states' rights, tariffs, and slavery. That isn't the purpose of this particular episode, but Florida was part of this. And so by the time we get into the middle 1830s, there was a movement afoot to make Florida make the transition from being a territory to become a state. Now, of course, as it became a state, it would have 2 voting senators in the United States Congress, and the one man whom we had been able to send as a delegate from 1821 forward and had been a non-voting delegate. Now, of course, he would in turn also have a vote in the House of Representatives. So people were saying, well, let's get going on this. Let's do it. But then there were others who said, no, wait, and a lot of people in Pensacola were of this particular opinion. They said, let's not rush into this. Because basically, if we take our time, we'll get more citizens in Florida, and then we can divide Florida up into not have one state, but we can divide it in half, make 2. Or some others looking even further ahead said, let's make it into 3 states. Well, people went back and forth with this conversation for a number of months, but finally the decision was made to proceed. And so in the latter part of the year 1838, a constitutional convention was held in the neighboring city over here of St. Joseph, and a Constitution was written. It was ultimately approved by the voters of the territory. It was signed by the governor and sent to the Congress. But Floridians had to wait up until the year 1845 before we achieved statehood, because there was no balancing state in the north to balance a state in the south, which tended to lean toward the issue of slavery in a positive way. And consequently, it would be 1845 before Florida did become a state. Now, when we did become a state, and that was, of course, official, it made no change at all in Pensacola, because the charter remained the same sort of election process was held here. And basically, as we moved forward into the latter parts of the 1840s and into the 1850s, Florida was growing slightly. Pensacola was more or less static, because the economic item which was beginning to drive much of the interest in Florida was in cotton. And the area that of course accompanies Pensacola and all of Escambia County was heavily forested. There was very little effort to begin wholesale cotton growing here, plus the fact that tests that had been made showed that the soil here was not appropriate. The cotton-bearing counties were about 100 miles to the east of us, and consequently, as we passed through the 1840s and into the 1850s, the communities of St. Joseph and Apalachicola were the ones that seemed to have all of the economic drive of the time. They were the ones that seemed to be on a growth speed. Of course, poor old St. Joseph ultimately suffered a terrible yellow fever epidemic, and it lost its momentum. But Apalachicola continued on in this same period. One thing that Pensacola did have in this period, of course, along with some of the same yellow fever, was the attempt to put down what they called maritime hospitals here. There were 3 different attempts at this, and a maritime hospital was something sponsored by the federal government, which operated on contract with the city and with local physicians, and they were to be available to take care of any yellow fever victims that came along on ships coming into the area, so that these men who would be literally taken off their vessels would have some place for treatment. The attempt was made 3 different times here, and the people of Pensacola didn't like that at all. They felt having a place where fever was contained, and of course they didn't understand the genesis of the fever at all. This was a hazard to the community, and the maritime hospital started and closed. The third one actually was burned, probably with arson, but that closed down as well. And so that's basically where things were as we moved into the 1850s, and the political climate nationally began to change more acutely. Pensacola was not a hotbed of secession or anything like that, but its people were caught up in the same fever. And that's where things were as we reached the latter part of the 1850s, which we will address in our next episode.